Alright, so we're going to begin the exploration of the C3 Sicilian. When white plays e4, black's most popular response is to play the move c5. This is the Sicilian defense, and it's really very sharp. If you play the open Sicilian, like knight f3, knight c6, and d4, then there are so many variations. There's knight f6, for example, d6, e6, and a6 even. So there's so many ideas that black can try here, which is why I recommend, in this position, playing the c3 Sicilian, also known as the Alpin. The c3 Sicilian is more calm. It gives white a really nice center. The idea is that after white plays the move d4, black captures on d4, white can capture back with a pawn, and still have two pawns remaining in the center, which gives him nice pawns on both e4 and d4. Let's see how this actually works. Usually after c3, black has two main options, knight f6 and the move d5. Now, we notice if you play something, for example, like knight c6, if white goes d4, trade, and let's say knight to f6, and white goes like knight to c3, white has a nice big center, and black has really no center established so far. So we don't need to be afraid of moves other than the two moves, knights f6 and d5, which directly attack white's center. Let's start out with d5. Now d5 takes advantage of the fact that the e4 pawn is unprotected. Black directly strikes in the center to try to get his own piece of it before white establishes his with d4 and e4 together. Now, white is really more or less forced to take the pawn here. So white takes on d5. White takes, black takes with the queen. Now, many players might be thinking, oh, this queen is in the center so early, right? We can attack it. But how? Black chooses this line because notice where this pawn is. Usually white would like to play something like knight to c3 and attack the queen. But the pawn is on c3, so the queen is really immune to attack for right now at least. Instead, white would probably choose to play d4, allowing his bishop to come out and controlling the part of the center that he wanted to, which is also the purpose why he played c3. So after d4, black plays knight to f6. White goes knight to f3 as well. Remember, the d4, e5 squares are very important in the c3 Sicilian. Now, black also wants to fight for his share of the center, and he develops his bishop to pin the knight. I'm aware that there are other lines. For example, black here could play something like e6, and after white develops normally, black can also develop normally. But this usually is not very complicated. I think white can get a good position pretty easily. Eventually, black will take, and white will get in knight c3. His bishop will have no problem developing, and white will get a position with good space, good development, an open position that's easy to play for players of all levels. However, if black plays bishop g4, this is the move that would be most concerning to me. He pins the knight, and the knight is the one that's guarding the d4 pawn. d4 is going to be a point that black tries to attack because it eventually will turn into an isolated queen pawn. Now, if black plays bishop g4, white's best choice is to break the pin with bishop to e2. Having developed his bishop, black plays e6 to develop his other bishop, and white simply castles. Black plays knight c6 to add more pressure onto the d4 pawn. Now, it's very important now for white to play the correct move. Black right now is threatening to win the d4 pawn, in fact. He has 1, 2, 3 attackers on the d4 pawn. And white really has two defenders because black can remove this knight at any time. Now, what we need to do right now is force black to make a choice. h3. Black can't win a pawn directly yet because after bishop takes f3, the bishop is attacking the queen, so black can't really take the pawn immediately. So black will usually play bishop to h5 and preserve the pair of bishops. In this case, white needs to protect the d4 pawn right now, and he will usually do so by playing bishop e3, developing another piece. Bishop e3 also puts pressure on the c5 pawn with the bishop, so black will usually play c takes d4, and forcing white to recapture with c takes d4. The d4 pawn is an isolated pawn. However, white now notices that he has the c3 square to use for his knight. So after black plays bishop e7, developing his bishop, white will develop his knight to c3, the square that he always wanted to develop it to, forcing black's queen to move back for perhaps d6. After queen d6, white really wants to develop his queen, because the d4 pawn should really be protected by a rook, not with the queen. Also, if white can somehow advance the d4 pawn to d5, then he gets a great position because his pieces are well developed and he'll have more space. White therefore plays queen b3, which attacks this pawn and prepares d5 in the future. Now, black doesn't need to defend the pawn. Black can castle. Taking the pawn here would be a mistake because you don't want black to play something like rook to b8 and skewer your own pawn on b2. However, white also has his own rooks to develop. White can play rook to d1. Black can likewise respond with rook to d8. And white will play, for example, a3. After a6, white finally develops his last rook. Play might continue on with knight a5, which is a common idea for black to gain tempo on the queen side. And now we see why we played a3. When black plays knight a5, we want to keep control of the d5 square in this diagonal. This b file is not very important for us. Queen a4 also is kind of useless. So the best square for the queen would be to go to a2. After something like b5, white can finally commit with g4 and bishop g6. And finally, the biggest idea for white to use in this kind of position is to play knight to e5. White goes knight to e5 because this pawn is supporting the knight as a knight post. I don't expect that the f6 knight will move anytime soon. If the f6 knight moves and black chooses to play the f pawn to f6, then the e6 pawn will be very weak. The queen is attacking it. And this diagonal is just not a great diagonal for black to open. Therefore, usually after knight g4, bishop g6, knight e5, white has a nice position. He should not be afraid of any attack on the king side because these pawns are still defending the king, and black can't get his pieces over to the king side enough to attack white. White can later on put his bishop to f3 with this nice long diagonal, and as long as he takes care of the queen side, making sure that black does not try something like b4, attack the pawn on b2, he should be fine. Eventually, white would like to attack in the center, and once again, play d5 if possible. But white's bishops will nevertheless enjoy the open position much more than black's bishops will. Now, going back to the main line, starting with c3, the other line for black is to play knight to f6. If black goes knight to f6, the idea is very similar to the idea in d5. He's attacking the pawn on e4 that is not defended. So white's got to play e5 now to get his pawn out of attack. Now e5 also wins a tempo, forcing black to move his knight once more to d5. Now white can play the main line d4, and c takes d4, c takes d4 for example, oops, not knight c3, c takes d4 for example, knight c6, knight f3, d6, and then bishop c4, knight b6, bishop b5, lines like this. These lines are fine, but I recommend the move here, g3. I believe that the bishop will be very nicely placed on this long diagonal. Black here will probably play something like knight to c6, attacking the e5 square. The e5 pawn is still weak. And now white will follow with bishop to g2, winning a tempo, attacking the knight on d5. Now, there's a trick here that I feel obligated to show. Black can try something like queen to c7. Obviously here, bishop takes d5 fails and loses the pawn to queen takes e5. This is a fork. And if white tries a logical d4, you must see that after takes, black can take on d4, leaving both knights hanging, yet not losing material. And black actually wins material here. If white takes on d4, black wins the bishop on c1 with check. And white will not be able to castle, and white is down a pawn. Now this is not a good line for white. Therefore, if black plays queen to c7, it's best to defend this pawn with queen to e2. Now keep in mind this knight on d5 is still being attacked. Therefore, black plays e6. White still needs to add one more defender to this pawn on e5. White plays knight f3. Black plays bishop e7. And this position after d3, castle, castle, should be fine for white. White's knight will be able to develop to d2 and then to c4 or e4. And white's bishop should have plenty of developing squares as well to maybe f4 in the future. For example, play could continue b6, c4, knight to b4, a3, knight to a6. White can go to c3 now, bishop b7, and then bishop f4. White finishes development, and eventually he would like to play something like d4 to finalize his pawn structure and not leave the d3 pawn backwards. However, since this is a trap line, black players will usually play something like e6. e6 is the main line which guards the knight on d5. Now, white will never take the knight on d5 with his bishop. If the bishop takes the knight, white gives away his great fianchetto bishop for a knight that's in the center but not that great. This g2 bishop is essential to the white position because it controls the light squares. Notice how white's pawns are all in dark squares, and therefore the light squares are weaker. If you trade away this bishop, then that's not really good for your position, because then you have no bishop to control these light squares. Instead, white now can choose to play knight f3. If black plays d6 to remove this advanced pawn, white can trade. And after castle, and then d4, black can trade the pawns. Oops, sorry, here, white will take with the knight. Remember here, white takes with the knight, not with the pawn, because he does not want to have an isolated queen pawn in this case. In this case, white rather open his bishop to this long diagonal and get his knight out of the way than to have an isolated queen pawn for the c3 square. Remember in the last line that white took on d4 with the c pawn because he liked to have knight c3 as an option. Here, knight c3 is, after c takes d4, knight c3 is much less effective as there's no queen on d5 to attack. White will play knight takes d4. Black will probably trade to avoid having isolated pawns himself. White will take with the queen. Remember, we don't want to take with the pawn and get an isolated pawn. Black will play bishop d7. And guys, now we can see this knight, this bishop here is so valuable that it will still not take the knight, even though he's being offered a pawn. White can win a pawn here, but after bishop c6, the compensation for black is all these weak squares around the king. Perfect for black's bishop to use, not really good for white. Therefore, white spends this time instead playing c4 to get this knight away. Now if the knight moves, black will lose b7. But after queen b6, queen takes, knight takes, white still doesn't want to spend time taking the pawn on b7. Instead, he will play rook to b1. And after knight takes c4, if black chooses to play this line, which is really risky, bishop f1, and rook c8, knight c3. Black's position here is very awkward with these two bishops in a row, still being skewered right now. And in fact, this position is just very, very bad for black. So going back to our c3 Sicilian, the main important thing to know right now is after c5, white plays c3 to establish the nice pawn center. The downside of this move is that white does not have the c3 square for the knight, but frequently later on, after a trade on d4, white can get the pawn away from c3 to d4, where then he can use his knight on c3. Here, black's two main responses are knight f6 and d5. After d5, white will eventually deal with an isolated queen pawn system, but he can also use the square on e5 for his knight and enjoy a nice space advantage with easy development. Or after knight f6, white will also have an advanced pawn on e5, and after knight d5 and g3, he will enjoy a nice long diagonal for his bishop, and as well an open position that's easy to play.